Chapter 16. Tidus had forgotten how good a shower could feel. The hot, cleansing water washed away months of filth, grime, and blood. He threw the clothes he had been wearing into the trash. They barely qualified as clothes anymore, to be honest. Only the boots were still technically functional. When he got redressed, his attire fit distinctly differently than it had before. He grimaced as he pulled his shirt down to cover his protruding ribs. He would definitely be glad to have regular meals again. He hadn't noticed he had grown taller until now. He had only noticed getting thinner, the details of his bones standing out under his skin. The debrief lasted hours, scouring through every detail of his first trial. At least he was able to eat during it, but even so, by the time it was over and Muse had wrung every bit of information out of him that she could, Tidus was exhausted. He laid down on his bed and pulled his comm screen towards him, checking for new messages. Disappointment pricked his heart when there was nothing. But then he checked the timestamps on the most recent messages and realized just how little time had passed for everyone else. He had exchanged messages with Ilaria just that morning, telling her they were soon to arrive at the first trial. Her encouraging response, accompanied by a dozen pictures of her clutch of crystal wing hatchlings, was only hours old. Tidus flipped through the pictures, a smile finding its way onto his face. Her pink eyes sparkled with happiness, holding the scaly, iridescent lizards like they were kittens. She was alive and safe and happy. Tidus opened a new message to send her and stared at the blank form for several minutes. There was so much he wanted to say to her, to talk to her about, but in private. He couldn't mention the resets she had been involved in over the comms, or their parents might see it. He dared not send information about the assassin that had come after him. That was secure information, even if Ilaria was allowed to know about it. The comms channel was too risky. This kind of a security breach had to be kept under wraps while it was investigated. There was so much he could only say to her in person, and he didn't know when he would see her face to face again. The reality of it weighed heavily on his chest. She was alive, safe, and happy, but entirely out of reach. "I made it. First trial complete," he typed finally. Then he added, "I miss you. Can't wait to see your dragons grow up." Tidus sighed, exhausted even by just the handful of words, and sent the message. He set aside the comm screen and pulled a pillow to cover his face. His entire body felt incongruous with the soft bed and blankets around him, like he no longer fit into reality correctly. The words of not Tidus wafted through his mind. What had happened to make him so bitter? How could he even suggest turning his back on the Empire? And was it actually possible? More importantly, if it was, would he want to? He didn't know he had fallen asleep until Timothy chimed him awake. Tidus groaned and threw his pillow at the speaker on the wall. "We have arrived at Dothara," Timothy said, making Tidus jolt the rest of the way awake and sit bolt upright. They were back at Dothara? Back home? Why? He opened his mouth to ask, but Timothy's voice continued. "You are expected to make your way to the shuttle in the next hour, so you and your fellow student can be taken to the cathedral." The word cathedral clicked it all into place. Tidus pulled up memories from before the first trial, of the classes and everything he had learned. The cathedral was the primary training facility and headquarters of the Omni Tempore. Of course they were back on Dothara. They just weren't home, not the way Tidus still thought of the word. The cathedral was across the planet from the estate on Rothzura. If he remembered the map correctly, it was only a few hours' shuttle ride away from Reklum, the capital city of the entire empire, the center of everything. "I would recommend making yourself presentable," Timothy's voice said, almost sounding judgmental. AI assistants were usually very neutral, occasionally programmed with something like a sense of humor, depending on their users' preferences. But something about Timothy's inflections, the way it talked, just teetering on the edge of emotion, was unsettling. After all, it's important to make a good first impression. "You sound like my mother," Tidus grumbled, rifling through his clothes, hoping his formal set would still fit. "I'll take that as a compliment," Timothy said. Then its light blinked off, deactivating until called upon again. Tidus squinted at the light. Was Muse pranking him? Tidus found his formal wear and put it on, grimacing at how it engulfed him as if he were a scarecrow, draping awkwardly over his skeletal frame. The pants and sleeves were too short, and what used to be perfect tailoring around the torso hung loose. It would have to do. Tidus looked at himself in the mirror, and his sunken eyes stared back at him from a gaunt face. And his hair, well, it was evident he had been living in a jungle for several months. That was for sure. He spent most of the hour he had to prepare trying to get his hair to look like it belonged to a member of society, instead of a wild savage. The matted locks were unsalvageable, so in the end he cut most of it off, leaving his ears chilled, exposed to the air. His stomach made its complaints well known by the time he hurried past the dining room and grabbed a few muffins to inhale. Dasha caught up to him there, her hair also cut much shorter, just reaching her chin. She had always been slim, but there was a hollowness to her cheeks, and a new scar on her lower lip and chin, lilac against the deep violet of her skin. She grinned at him, the scar pulling her smile crooked. "Morning," she said. "Not even gonna take a minute to savor an actual breakfast? Seriously?" "Not even gonna wear a real shirt for your introduction to the cathedral? Seriously?" Tidus quipped back, raising an eyebrow. Her wardrobe of leggings and tank tops was like a universal constant. At least she was wearing shoes. "They haven't handed out a dress code, so as far as I'm concerned, this is completely appropriate," Dasha said. "At least I'm wearing clothes." Heat rushed to Tidus' face at that, an image of her completely unclothed flashing unbidden through his mind, and he quickly turned around. Dasha cackled at his discomfort. "Oh, maybe you'd prefer if I didn't." She taunted, leaning towards him. "Dasha," Tidus sputtered. No. Keep your clothes on. Just look. Let's go before we're late." Fine, Dasha said. She strode past him, flicking his leg with her tail as she passed. Tidus shoved an entire muffin into his mouth and fought to get his complexion back under control. He was only pretty sure he had succeeded when they both arrived at the shuttle. Instead of finding Muse waiting for them, the voice of Timothy chimed in. "Glad to see you're both ready," the AI said. "Take your seats. The shuttle will be departing in 3 minutes." "Muse isn't coming?" Tidus asked. "No," Timothy responded. "She has received a new assignment." Tidus shook his head and decided not to ask. As curious as he was about the Omni Tempore missions, it didn't matter enough. Not right now, anyway. Instead, he focused on finishing the armful of muffins he had snatched, then meticulously brushed off any trace of crumbs from his clothes, so he could be as presentable as possible when he first arrived at the cathedral. "How long did it take you before your assassin showed up?" Dasha's voice broke through Tidus' thoughts. He glanced over at her, barely suppressing a startled jump at her voice. It was strange being around people, even just one, after so long alone. Almost 6 months, Tidus said. He wished he knew more of what to expect when they arrived at the cathedral. That was becoming a familiar feeling. He used to know what to expect wherever he went, even if it was somewhere new. He would have a thorough explanation given to him so that he could behave accordingly and avoid embarrassing the family. Now it seemed the Omni Tempore training was content to simply toss him around with no context, just to see what he would do. Maybe that was the point. "Huh," Dasha said, sitting up and leaning towards him, pulling his attention to her once again. Tidus shifted farther away from her. "About the same as me, then. Interesting. You know," she smiled and reached a hand towards the side of his head. "I kinda like the new look." Tidus jerked his head away, her finger brushing his ear. Tidus glared at her. "Can you not keep your hands to yourself?" he snapped. Dasha leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. Was she actually pouting? "You'd think a guy who just spent 6 months alone would be a little more interested." "What, you think I spent my first trial missing you? Egotistical much?" Dasha rolled her eyes and laughed, popping a shiny piece of candy into her mouth. "You know what? Never mind." Tidus shook his head and tried to ignore the looks Dasha kept sending him. If throwing them into the deep end to observe how they responded was the point, what were the Omni Tempore looking for? Were they looking for someone who could obey protocol, keep a level head and appropriate behavior even with so much uncertainty? Or were they looking for someone with self-assuredness, someone who didn't care about a lack of protocol or expectations, like Dasha? Tidus caught himself biting his lip and stopped. Tidus would never be able to pull off the kind of confidence Dasha had. Hers came off as careless, and Tidus didn't want people to think that way about him. But did he look timid, weak next to her? All too soon the shuttle landed, and the doors slid open. Tidus and Dasha stood and walked out. Tidus stopped at the bottom of the ramp, his eyes widening as he tilted his head back to take in the entirety of the building ahead of him. The shuttle had landed in a wide cobblestone courtyard leading directly into the cathedral. The building was aptly named, all stone spires and stained glass. The hills around it framed the scene like any of the historical paintings he had seen at the university. Rolling and green, dappled with flowers, all of it the definition of picturesque. Tidus craned his neck to see the tops of the cathedral's spires, as Dasha stepped up to stand next to him. "Impressive," she said, leaning her weight on one foot casually. "Glad you approve," a condescending voice responded. Tidus jumped, snapping his eyes back down to ground level. He felt his face pale. A woman stood a few yards ahead of them, with long elven ears, bright golden eyes, and long blue hair. She wore the distinct gold-trimmed robes of the Omni Tempore. "Now, if you are done gaping, we can get on with the introductions," the woman said. Tidus clasped his hands behind him and squared his shoulders. First impressions only came around once. "Absolutely. I apologize for my distraction," Tidus replied, bowing towards the woman. He might not know the exact rules here, but this woman reminded him of others he had met the few times he had been to events with aristocracy from Reklum itself, with the families that far outranked his own. Expectations hung around her like a palpable cloud of fog. "Noted," the woman said. "All right. I know who you are, so don't bother introducing yourselves. I am Magina Perrin. I am the second highest ranking member of the Omni Tempore, and I am the headmaster of this training program. Understand, we have no need of weakness. You have passed your first trial, but there will be 4 more before you will be granted the privilege of even attempting to join our ranks." She paused, making eye contact with each of them, making sure they understood. Tidus gave a nod but kept his mouth shut. He got the distinct impression she was not opening the floor to questions. Dasha didn't seem to have the same instinct, and he cringed inwardly as she crossed her arms before she spoke. "Well, we don't plan on bringing weakness to your ranks," she said, far too flippantly for the situation. Magina narrowed her eyes at Dasha, and Tidus fought the urge to step away from her. "I won't allow any of our students to stumble their way into undeserved success," Magina continued, moving past Dasha's comment without acknowledgement. "We will have only the Timecasters of the highest quality to serve the Emperor. Your options are to be the best, or to be eliminated. Is that clear?" "Yes, ma'am," Tidus answered, and Dasha followed suit a moment later. She didn't add any more comments, which was a relief. "Good." Magina sighed, and turned towards the large stained glass doors to the cathedral. "Make sure you pay attention. No one who tries to skate by with guesswork will last here." The stained glass doors swung open as Magina approached. They looked too old to be mechanized, so either the technology had been painstakingly added to be invisible afterwards, or the doors worked off of old enchantments instead. Tidus suspected the latter. The walls of the cathedral's entry hall were adorned with exquisite murals. The distinct iconography of the god Emperor Prometheus in his radiant crown stared down at them, followed by the triple-headed golden dragon and the dark figure of the Emperor's shadow, familiar, recognizable from the Imperiatus Divinatum and the temples of Dothara. But instead of following the traditional litany of the Emperor's victories and mercies, the origins of the Reklum Empire and its expansion into the universe, the following paintings held unfamiliar scenes. Warriors in robes with gold flowing around them, the Omni Tempore, possibly the very first members. Dark creatures with too many claws and too many eyes. Tidus tried to absorb as much detail as he could as they walked past, itching to stop and study them, but he forced himself to keep pace with Magina. The second highest-ranking Omni Tempore swept through the magnificent entry hall and led both of them to a stone chamber with gold symbols scrawled across the walls. She gestured towards a series of stone chairs that looked like they were carved from the same piece of stone as the floor, and as soon as Tidus and Dasha were seated, 2 more figures entered the room. Chapter 17. Tidus could feel Dasha bite back a gasp at the sight of them, and he didn't blame her. He had only ever seen Imperial savants from a distance before, and certainly had never expected to be within breathing distance of them. Despite his determination to keep up appearances, to make a good impression and follow the bare minimum of social protocol, Tidus could only stare. These savants had probably been elves originally, Tidus decided. They had the long ears, but other than that, they looked like no elf he had ever seen. They wore flowing gray robes trimmed with the black, red, and gold of the Omni Tempore. Their skin was the rusty color of clay, and their opalescent hair was buzzed short, with old draconic symbols shaved into the sides of their heads. All of it did nothing to soften the effect of their eyes. Completely blank white, with a faint sheen, like massive pearls set into their eye sockets. The eyes were strange and unsettling, like they could see right through Tidus to his very soul. Solid-colored eyes weren't that strange themselves. Dasha's eyes, for one thing, were solid jade green with no iris, pupil, or other visible features. Most fiendlings had eyes like hers, and they weren't the only such race in the Empire, to say nothing of the multifaceted eyes of the insectoids. But the pearly orbs set into the faces of the savants were different from any of that. If eyes were the window to the soul, the savants instead had mirrors. The savants didn't speak. One of them approached Tidus, The other, Dasha. Even her swishing tail had gone still with their proximity.
The savants of the cathedral will be the ones to grant you the recognition that you have completed each trial,
Magina said, standing in front of the room. Tidus forced himself to look at her, rather than watch the savants as the one next to him pushed Tidus' sleeve up his arm. With the word recognition, Magina gestured to her own golden tattoos, like the ones Muse had, and the future version of himself in the timescape.
They are not simple markings, as you will soon realize. They will assist you in forging your abilities, like opening a channel to let your power flow through. You receive them accordingly, as you prove you will be able to wield that power without shattering under the weight of it.
Tidus suppressed a shiver at the words. The savant beside Tidus picked up his hand and turned it over to be palm up. The way they moved was eerie, like a shadow through fog. Tidus only mostly contained his flinch when the needle pricked his skin. It stung, but it didn't hold a candle to the pain of death. Tidus quickly rearranged his features into a neutral expression.
From today on, you are expected to dedicate everything you have to your training,
Magina said.
There is no room for doubt, for wavering faith, or for anything less than your complete dedication to serving the Emperor.
Tidus bit the inside of his cheek to keep his expression under control, her words burning as much as the savant's needle on his skin. Not Tidus' words flashed through his mind. If you step out of line, they'll kill your family. Was that true? How much of a fumble would it take? Would his family be the price of a moment of weakness? If it was a price he refused to pay.
Understanding and enacting his will is the purpose of the angelic legions,
Magina continued.
You have completed the first of 5 trials. If you survive to complete the 5th trial, you will become a part of the Interim Legion until you either claim a rank of your own or one becomes available.
Magina clasped her hands behind her back, surveying Tidus and Dasha with a look of superiority in her eyes. Tidus set his jaw. He knew what was coming.
Wait a minute,
Dasha said, her tail lashing anxiously.
How do you claim a rank? You kill the one who holds it,
Magina said, blunt and unapologetic. His future self had warned him, but even so, hearing it from the mouth of the second highest ranked Omni Tempore made it seem more real, more inevitable. He would have blood on his hands if he wanted to survive long enough to unravel not Tidus' ominous warnings.
What?
Dasha gasped. Tidus managed to keep his gaze on Magina, unwavering. He wouldn't show weakness, even if the thought of killing to claim his rank made him want to vomit. He had died enough to never want to inflict that on someone else. But this was the will of the Emperor. As brutal as it sounded, it was necessary. It must be. The Omni Tempore fought threats no one else could. They had to be the best. They could afford no softness, no weakness. It was only for the good of the citizens of the Empire that this was demanded of the Timecasters. Tidus clung to that truth, that the will of the Emperor was the ultimate good. It had to be.
Was my statement unclear?
Magina asked icily. Dasha's tail went still.
No, ma'am,
she said. Does it not make it difficult to work together with the Omni Tempore? Tidus asked. To trust one another?
We are not here to make friends, Magina said sharply. Our purpose is to serve the Emperor and enact his will. That is far more important than our own self-satisfaction and glory. You do not need to trust others if you can sufficiently trust your own strength."
Her words left a sour taste in Tidus' mouth, and he fought to keep it off his face. The loneliness of the first trial still sat like a stone in his chest, and got heavier with the thought that, even among the other students, and eventually the Omni Tempore, he could never trust anyone. There would be no true camaraderie. Every Timecaster he met would be an existential threat, someone who would kill him if he didn't kill them first. Tidus felt his chest constrict, like it was being squeezed in a vice. Would it be worth it to survive the trials and become a killer, just to survive alone, isolated? Ilaria's face, so full of confidence and trust in him, flashed through his mind. No, he wouldn't be entirely alone. He would have his family. He would have Ilaria. No matter what, he could count on that. It would be worth it for her sake.
"You are not permitted to kill an unranked Timecaster," Magina continued. "You will have to restrain yourselves from that until you pass your trials and enter the ranks."
Dash's gaze flickered to meet Tidus, a series of emotions rushing through her eyes. Fear, determination, maybe a hint of something like bloodlust. It made Tidus want to cringe away, but he kept still as the savant was still working. He could see in Dash's gaze a plain truth. She might not want to kill him, but she was already calculating how to do it when the time came.
"You will be provided with a training schedule," Magina said. "You may communicate with your families if you wish, but you will keep all locations and secure information strictly confidential. Anyone you reveal restricted information to will be killed."
Tidus clenched his fists, then winced and looked down. The savant was putting the finishing touches on the golden tattoo, like a ribbon wrapped twice around his wrist, starting in his palm and ending on the back of his arm, extending up towards the elbow. It reminded him of the tether he had imagined and grabbed onto to pull himself back to the correct time. Magina smiled, baring her teeth like a wolf, and outstretched her arms.
"You will have today to rest and familiarize yourselves with the cathedral, and tomorrow the real work begins," she said. "Welcome to your new home."
With that, she swept out of the room, just as the savants lifted their tools and backed away. Tidus flexed his arm. He was sure that regular tattoos should be red and tender, needing time to heal. This one sat on his skin as naturally as if he had been born with it, and it made him feel stronger, healthier, somehow more whole. Dash's was thinner, more delicate, like the golden chain of a necklace winding its way up her arm. Tidus stood at the same time as Dasha, and she hurried to leave the room ahead of him, not looking back. Tidus couldn't blame her, not now that she knew the truth. The Omni Tempore were the definition of cutthroat. The way things had been on the Epoch's Echo, familiar and friendly, was unsustainable. Tidus found his way to his room with directions from Timothy, who at this point seemed to be the Omni Tempore's standard AI assistant. His luggage had already been deposited in the room, larger than the one on the Epoch's Echo had been, with graceful arched windows and white marble. Tidus quickly changed out of his formal attire into a more casual outfit. Most of his clothes from home had been replaced between the Epoch's Echo and here. The new clothes were all black, with red and gold accents. The hourglass and Ouroboros crest of the Omni Tempore was stamped over the heart on every shirt and the left knee of all the pants. The loose, athletic fit of the clothes Tidus put on only somewhat helping to disguise his thin frame. The dining hall was his next stop. He needed to gain his weight and muscle mass back as quickly as possible. 3 other students were there when he arrived. All had golden tattoos around both arms, and one with tattoos around their neck as well. They eyed Tidus critically, and set his teeth on edge. The way they looked at him told him that while they weren't permitted to kill each other, that wasn't the same as being forbidden from it. If they could get away with killing him and not get caught, they would take the opportunity, with no hesitation. Tidus took his food with him and found himself, instead, wandering back to the entry hall. He might as well take this opportunity to study the paintings. His schedule after today could be rigorous enough he didn't know when he would get another chance. The first painting in the sequence, as far as he could tell, held the tall, majestic form of the Emperor Prometheus, cupping a bright burst of gold in his hands, like a sun resting in his palms. Behind him, like a wreath of power, was something almost like a clock face, but with time-casting runes instead of numbers. It must be a depiction of the Emperor creating Timecasters, granting the ability to cut through time to the mortals of his empire. Tidus itched to copy down the ring of symbols, but that could very well activate some effect he wasn't prepared for, so he settled for memorizing them as he ate his way through his napkin full of sausages, savoring the taste of meat after so long surviving only off the fruit of the jungle.
"It's always so comforting to see the new arrivals."
A voice came from behind Tidus, and he tensed. He turned to find the owner, an Astron, an elf-like race of people that came from the purple nebulas. Their skin was deep blue, hair a bright silver like moonbeams. Their eyes were hidden behind magenta lenses, filtering the light from the spectrum of the Astron's home to let them see in detail on the surface of a planet. Their mouth was twisted in a smirk. Tidus didn't want them to explain the statement. He could tell that from the look on their face, so he didn't ask. "The paintings are impressive," he said instead. "Have you spent much time studying them?"
"I use my time to study more important things,"
they sneered, tossing their long hair over their shoulder pompously. They reminded Tidus of Tavarius, and he almost snorted out loud at the hair flip.
"Which is why I can tell you won't be any competition at all."
The starry elf smiled like they were baring fangs. Compared to Magina, the effect was distinctly lackluster.
"You'll be easy to kill when the time comes."
"Oi, Zion!" A new voice entered the room. Tidus startled and glanced at the newcomer, an Oletheron with tall ears and slitted amber eyes. His bushy tail swished behind him. "I know the newbies are the only ones you can impress, but come on, don't you get bored of this?" The newcomer circled around to stand near Tidus, setting his nerves farther on edge. He didn't want to put his back to either of them. They reminded him too much of the large predators of the jungle. His only consolation was they looked close to him in age, and each only had the first golden tattoo around their right wrists. The Astron's was like a bundle of spider silk threads, all looping around their wrist and arm, never quite intersecting one another. The Oletheron's was like a thick golden rope, his fur tinted a glimmering gold over the ink on his skin.
"This is hardly entertainment,"
Zion said dryly,
"just keeping track of the incoming competition, or, well, lack thereof."
They shot Tidus another smirk, and he scowled. Zion laughed at that, the cruel kind of laughter meant to make the recipient feel small. Tidus tried to let it slide off him, but it wasn't easy. He didn't know enough about this place, or about the other students, to know how seriously he should take any of the threats. It was best to treat all of them with complete severity at this point. Everyone here was a mortal threat, deadly competition. Zion swept out of the room as they laughed, leaving Tidus with the Oletheron. They were similar to other catfolk from Dothara and other planets scattered throughout the Empire, but there was a look to the Oletherons Tidus had come to recognize. Native to the Astral Archipelago, orbiting Nora alongside Dothara, they were the first to be welcomed into the Empire when it had reached out to other planets. The Oletherons were one of the few races with a natural affinity for life in space, learning from childhood magics that would allow them to breathe and survive in the great nothingness.
"Hey, don't take Zion too seriously," the Oletheron said, reaching his hands behind his head as if he were lounging on the ground. "They're total slime on the best of days."
"Thanks," Tidus said, subtly edging away from the other boy. He wanted to ask how long he had been here, how much training he had, maybe what he could share, but the questions died on his tongue. The other boy carried himself with confidence, wiry muscles shifting beneath his sandy fur. He was definitely dangerous.
"Helix,"
the boy said.
"I'm Helix."
"Right," Tidus said. Tidus." He didn't offer his hand. Zion, at least, had been open about their intentions. Helix seemed content to just hang around, but why? To see what Tidus was like? To scope out his abilities, perhaps hoping Tidus wouldn't know what he was up to. Helix sighed and dropped his arms back to his sides.
"Okay, I get it,"
he said with what at least appeared to be a good-natured smile.
"I can see what you're thinking. What is he up to? What kind of trick is this? I remember what that was like. But hey, not all of us are like Zion, you know. I mean, we're not allowed to kill each other during training, so might as well get along in the meantime, right?"
Tidus furrowed his brow at that. "You expect me to just ignore the fact that you will eventually try to kill me?" Helix sighed, shoulders slumping, and Tidus almost felt bad. But his self-preservation kept him from acting on it. If he was going to get through training, make everything he had done worth it, and make sure his assassin never got the chance to go after his family, he couldn't afford to do something stupid, like let his guard down around people who would absolutely try to kill him. Especially when it was such an openly known fact. He would be an idiot not to take that threat seriously. Offers of friendship always came with strings attached. That had been true even before the stakes had been life or death. He couldn't treat Helix with any less scrutiny than he would have given any of the aristocrats' children who had tried worming their way into his good graces before.
"Maybe not,"
Helix said.
"All right, I'll leave you so you can go back to whatever you were doing. I guess I'll see you in training."
Helix left, his tail swishing around the corner with such a flourish that Tidus thought it must have been intentional. Tidus had thought that when he passed the first trial, he would be able to sleep soundly. Now he realized his error. The cathedral was just as dangerous as the jungle, maybe more so, and the only way to survive would be to become just as dangerous as the rest. Chapter 18. Mornings at the cathedral started early. The first half of the day was dedicated to academic study, strategy, runes, timeline divergence theory, and the history of the Omni Tempore. Unlike the classes on the Epoch's Echo, these classes were split into specific topics instead of an overall study of the basics. The math for determining the potential impact of a person's timecasting became more complex by orders of magnitude the farther back in time they went. Unless, importantly, a timecaster went somewhere isolated, like during the first trial, so their actions wouldn't ripple out beyond themselves. Going back far enough among a civilization and changing enough in the past could splinter time in ways much more destructive than just diverging timelines. Muse's warning to Tidus about accidentally turning himself inside out was suddenly a lot more viscerally terrifying. The second half of every day was for physical training, including no small amount of sparring against the instructors and other students. It was supposed to help them learn how to apply the timecasting they were practicing, to turn it into muscle memory and instinct, and prepare them for field work. So far, it had only shown Tidus how far behind the rest of the students he was. Even after all his progress during the first trial, he left every sparring match on the losing end. He learned to read people, to read the fights, and a realization began to dawn on him. He had never had the assassin on the ropes at all. They had just been toying with him, evaluating him, letting him win. That only added to the smoldering ember of fear inside of him.
I am invested in a very particular future.
The words of the assassin haunted his every waking moment. They had never been trying to kill him, so it all must have been some kind of manipulation. But what did they want from him? What was the point of it all? The only thing that alleviated the constant, crushing pressure of training, of trying to learn enough so he could piece things together, were the frequent letters from Ilaria. Never less than once a week, she sent him pictures and stories of what she had been up to, a glimmer of joy in his mounting pile of stress. His parents wrote to him as well, short messages, gilded with formality and full of the pride they felt at having a son who could serve the Emperor. Kiun hadn't written at all. Tidus had sent him a few messages after his first trial, but they had all gone unanswered. Every week that went by with this silence from his brother brought a sting worse than he'd felt the previous one. Kiun had always been someone who could hold a dragon's grudge. Tidus had just never expected to be on the receiving end of it. Tidus pushed away the bitterness and tucked his comm screen under his arm, heading for the library. His ribs ached, and he knew purple bruises were blooming over his torso from his last sparring match. Lynn was particularly hard to dodge, with her wings giving her an extra axis of mobility, and her talons wickedly sharp. She never held back either. Not that Tidus wanted the others to hold back against him, in theory. In practice, it felt like trying to learn to swim while his head was being held under water. Tidus wound his way through the library, heading for a corner bench overlooking the garden waterfall he had found the week before. He grimaced as pain in his back flared and steadied himself against a bookshelf. "If you want, I can give you some pointers," a voice chirped. Tidus nearly jumped out of his skin. He whirled around to see Helix grinning at him and knocked his back against the bookshelf. "I mean, unless you actually like getting beaten to a pulp. But that doesn't really seem like your thing." Tidus stepped back, his heart still racing from the surprise. Helix had hovered around ever since that first day, watching him, sometimes trying to catch him after classes. Tidus had become adept at avoiding the Oletheron over the past weeks, and no one could sneak up on Tidus easily anymore. Not since he had habitually started using hindsight and foresight whenever he could. That had kept him alive with the assassin trailing him, and only made it more terrifying when someone did manage to surprise him. "What do you want?" Tidus asked. "I just told you," Helix said, and Tidus fought the urge to cringe at his own stupid question. "Look, you don't have to trust me, or like me, I guess. I'm just offering to help." "Why would you help me?" Tidus demanded. Helix offered the assistance like it was nothing, like it was the most natural thing in the world, but they both knew better. Why would he help someone he would one day, in all likelihood, have to fight to the death? Make a more dangerous opponent for himself? The teachers, he understood, it was their job, and they had all their training. They were so far ahead of the students, it would be years at minimum before the students were a threat to them. But the other students, they were all direct threats to each other. "I guess saying 'cause I'm bored' sounds fake, huh?" Helix said. "Pretty fake," Tidus concurred. "Well, guess I'll see you in the ring tomorrow," Helix said, shrugging and turning to walk away. "Good luck." Tidus watched him go. He hadn't actually sparred Helix yet. The first 2 weeks at the cathedral had been mostly instructive matches against teachers, and they had only started peppering in the real sparring against the other students once he had mastered the basics. Tidus chewed his lip. His ribs complained loudly when he inhaled. Memories of his fight with Lyn imprinted on his skin. Had he just made tomorrow's sparring match worse? Would Helix retaliate against his rejection by showing Tidus just how far superior he was at fighting? A wave of weariness washed over Tidus at the thought. He turned and headed towards his room. Not to sleep. He had work to do, and still had Illaria's letter to read. But he couldn't bring himself to do either in a public place at this point. He couldn't let Illaria become a weakness for him, something the other students could target and taunt him about. She was the only thing that kept him going. He had to protect her just as fervently as if she were there in person.
"I bet you're learning so many amazing things. I can't wait to hear about it."
Tidus could practically hear Illaria's voice as he read the text.
"I miss you a lot, Tidus. I wish you could do your studying from home. I know you have to be away, and I'll be okay, but it's a lot more boring around here without you. My crystal wings have gotten so big now. I think their breath should manifest soon, so I'll have to be careful. Maybe when I've trained them enough, you can have one as a pet. Then it can be like I'm with you, and you won't be lonely. Ask if you're allowed to have a pet, and tell me right away. I'll pick the very best one for you."
Tidus smiled and flipped through the series of pictures she had sent. The crystal wings had gotten to be the size of medium dogs, their scaly heads coming up to Illaria's waist. Their iridescent wings refracted light in every picture, casting rainbows over their surroundings. Illaria herself looked startlingly older than the last time Tidus had seen her in person, more mature, with a wisdom in her eyes that pained Tidus. He couldn't help but feel partly responsible for that. It was his fault. She had to carry the memory of his death. 2 memories of his death, technically, even if she had only witnessed one of them. And she had to remember his failure to save Kiun. Tidus had failed her, and he had failed her so completely that even resetting time couldn't fix it. She would always be changed by what he'd done, less innocent and carefree than she should be. The memory of the assassin shifting into the shape of his sister, using the fear in her pink eyes against him, rose to the surface and chilled him to his core. He couldn't let his failure cost Illaria, or the rest of his family, anything more than it already had. Helix stood across the sparring ring from Tidus, grinning, with his head cocked to the side, and one ear flopped lazily down. His pupils were dilated wide with excitement. Tidus took a deep breath and rolled his shoulders, trying to loosen up and prepare. He had managed to get some footage of Helix's previous sparring matches from Timothy, and had spent the previous evening coming up with a strategy to specifically counter Helix's fighting style. The issue now would be whether he could pull it off. Tidus could visualize how to beat Helix, but the Oletheron moved with such instinctive ease and razor-sharp reflexes that it would take everything Tidus had just to keep pace. The instructor gave the signal for them to start, and both of them sprang into action. Tidus darted to the side, avoiding Helix's initial charge, then immediately pulled up foresight. He caught a glimpse of Helix's next attack and shifted to slide back in time, just a few seconds, just enough to appear on Helix's other side and aim a hard kick at his back. Helix spun around and swept Tidus' legs out from under him. He hadn't even used timecasting to dodge. Tidus hit the ground with a grunt and rolled, springing back to his feet in time to see Helix rush to the side. Tidus could feel sweat already beating on his forehead, his heart hammering to keep him on high alert.
"Impressive,"
Helix said.
"You've been studying me, huh?"
Tidus scowled and dodged Helix's next attack, ramming an elbow into his ribs as he ducked past. He tried to ignore Helix's banter, focusing on the strategy he had spent the night formulating. Helix grunted, then laughed, crouching on the ground in a cat-like stance. Tidus backed up, re-establishing foresight so he could dodge whatever Helix threw at him next. Helix dashed past him. Tidus spun out of the way, but Helix's foot connected with his back and sent him stumbling with a stab of pain. He had hit one of the bruises from the previous day.
"No, I mean it," Helix said. "You're a fast learner. I'm impressed."
"Are you even taking this seriously?" Tidus demanded. Helix laughed, and Tidus' infuriation flared brighter.
"The whole point of these sparring sessions is to learn, not just to win," Helix said. "So I'd say I'm taking this plenty seriously."
"You're mocking me," Tidus growled. He focused in on foresight to target his next attack. Helix jumped out of the way, landing lightly out of reach. His tail lashed behind him, and then he was on top of Tidus, slamming into his chest, pinning him to the ground. Tidus' skull impacted on the padded floor with a thunk, and his vision swam.
"It's not like I think I'm better than you,"
Helix said calmly, though his pupils had shrunk down since the fight had started. Narrow, focused.
"I've just had more practice."
Tidus pulled at the time particles, trying to shift to a few moments before, to undo this defeat, but something held the time against him. With a start, he realized it was Helix. A glimmer of gold flashed across Helix's amber eyes. He was using his own timecasting directly against Tidus. He could feel it like a pressure on his mind. The very beginnings of a migraine. Tidus pushed harder, and then the pressure burst into pain, blood gushing from his nose, and he cried out.
"Sedna!"
Helix cursed, jumping off Tidus. Tidus lunged after him, spitting out a mouthful of blood, but Helix wasn't fighting now. He looked down at Tidus like he was going to say something else, then turned without a word and left the ring. His tail wrapped around his own ankle as he left in a bizarre gesture. He hunched his shoulders and slunk around the corner out of view. Tidus scowled and pushed himself upright, wiping blood from his face. 2 months at the cathedral, and Tidus had a decent grasp on the social hierarchy here, but he still couldn't understand Helix. He wasn't unintelligent, and he was very skilled. In some moments, he seemed to treat things very seriously, only to turn around and treat it like a joke in the very same breath. And he never treated Tidus like competition, only like a game, offering to help Tidus, making casual conversation in the middle of the sparring match, always watching him. Anywhere else, it could be seen as friendly, but here, they weren't here to make friends. Of course, it could all be a performance. The thought hit Tidus like a gust of wind, echoing with the voice of his father. People were only nice like this when they wanted something. That was a lesson his father had made sure Tidus had learned young. That just left the question, what did Helix want? Chapter 19. Tidus woke up screaming. Again. The feeling of his flesh melting off his bones, sizzling in the heat of the blaze, roared through his mind. The pain was suffocating. The echoes of death hit him with all the force of the first time, and by the time Tidus got his breathing under control and stopped screaming, he was drenched in sweat, with tears streaking his face. He lay in his bed, drawing each shuddering breath slowly. Every nerve in his body felt exposed. Every touch was a lightning strike of agony. Tidus closed his eyes and focused on his heartbeat, his breathing, the flow of time around him and the flow of blood through his veins. It pulsed in a comforting rhythm, constant. He was alive. He was intact and safe. Well, safe from being burned to death at least. Finally, Tidus pushed himself upright and swung his feet over the side of the bed to rest on the cold tile. His comm screen blinked with a notification, a new letter from Ilaria. A lump rose in his throat. He wanted to talk to her, to talk to anyone really, to force this pain out of his head and put it somewhere else. But even if she were here, could he really talk to her about this? Burden her with even more pain? She was still only 11. She was the only one who knew what he had done, who remembered parts of what haunted his dreams. But he already hated that. He couldn't add more to her tiny shoulders. And there was no one at the cathedral he could afford to show weakness to. Tidus swallowed hard and forced himself out of bed. It had been a while since one of his deaths had hit him so hard. He had gotten better at shaking off the nightmares, at moving past them. Today, he welcomed the distraction of the academic lessons, pouring himself into the work of memorizing runes and timeline diagrams. But when he resurfaced hours later for the break between classes, the crackle of flames and searing heat were there, waiting at the periphery of his memory, begging to be let back on center stage. By the time classes were over, he was exhausted from the effort of keeping himself in the moment. He tucked his comm screen under his arm and forced his feet to take him to the library. He was glad he had saved Ilaria's letter to read after classes. It was like a lifeline he could cling to throughout the day. Tidus came around the corner of the bookshelf and stopped short. Lounging in the patch of sun that illuminated the window bench was none other than Helix. Of course. Tidus gritted his teeth in frustration and turned to leave. He had thought that Helix had finally let up, had stopped shadowing him around after their sparring match 3 weeks before. And now here he was. Tidus didn't have the energy for a confrontation over something as simple as a study spot, even if leaving it behind pained him like pulling out a fingernail. As he pivoted to leave, he heard a shift of fabric and fur as Helix got up, but he didn't turn around. "Hey," Helix spoke from behind him. You don't have to go." Tidus did turn then, eyeing the feline boy warily. Helix stood in a deliberately non-threatening stance, keeping his hands visible and distinctly away from the dagger at his hip. "Sorry, it's a great spot to study in, right? You can use it if you want. I can go." Tidus narrowed his eyes, still unable to figure out the motive behind everything Helix did. It didn't add up to make any kind of sense. "Why? You were here first." "You looked pretty disappointed," Helix said with a shrug. "And even though you don't seem to believe me, I'm not trying to bug you all the time. There are plenty of places I can study." Tidus considered it, his thumb running along the edge of the comm screen as his gaze wandered to the window. The sun glinted off the garden's waterfall. It reminded him so much of home, of the gardens at the Antirrhinum estate. His favorite spot in the library back home had a view so much like this, and Helix had offered to leave. For some reason, the thought of asking him to stay, or just studying with someone else in his proximity, sent a shudder of relief through Tidus. It was startling. He had been lonely for so many months. It had started to feel like a part of him, but it wasn't a part he liked. "Well, I'm going to use the desk," Tidus said, gesturing towards the small table that offered a direct view out the window. "So, there's no reason for you to leave either. If you want to keep using the bench, It sounded so awkward and forced the moment he said it that he wanted to take it back immediately. To just say never mind to the whole thing and walk away before Helix had a chance to respond. But he didn't. A faint flush crept up his neck as he stood there, waiting for Helix to process his words. Helix nodded. "If you're sure," he said, stepping back towards the bench then. "Thanks." Tidus nodded and sat down at the desk, opening his comm screen to find his notes from the day. Ilaria's letter could wait. Having Helix so close made him nervous, the same way any of the other students made him nervous, really. But for some reason, as they both settled in, and Helix lounged in his line of sight, it was easier to breathe, to focus. He might have been inviting trouble, putting an extra layer of risk and distraction on his study session. But having someone close by made things feel a little more right, more normal, more like home. Maybe it was because it gave his mind something else to worry about that wasn't just replaying his deaths. Low-level paranoia might not be very relaxing under normal circumstances, but it was at least an improvement to his growing list of nightmares. Tidus let himself sink into his studies, the routine a comforting familiarity. Helix lounged on the bench in the shifting patch of sun, occasionally flipping pages of the book he was reading. Nearly an hour into studying, Helix sat up and stretched, reminding Tidus vividly of the pet cats he had seen. He almost smiled at the thought. Then Helix's tail swished out and caught on a glass model of the Nora star system, identical to the one his father had confiscated in the timeline he had ruined. It fell and shattered on the tile floor, the sound deafening in the stillness of the library. Tidus felt his heart stop. He had managed to avoid getting into trouble here, but he couldn't imagine they were any less strict than his tutors back home, or at the university itself, or his parents. Helix didn't even flinch. He just groaned in slight annoyance, then reached his hand down towards the shattered pieces. Tidus' eyes widened as he watched the time particles coalesce around Helix's clawed hand, swirling like the sand in an hourglass. Tendrils of sandy time particles reached down and latched on to the broken pieces. Helix brought his hand up, fingers moving like he was manipulating the strings of a puppet, and the broken pieces followed, knitting themselves back together until the model rested completely unharmed back on the shelf it had originally inhabited. "Wow," Tidus breathed. Helix's eyes snapped over to him, and Tidus ducked his head. He fought down the rising heat in his cheeks and cleared his throat. That was pretty cool." "Thanks," Helix said with a grin. "I'm clumsy enough. That little trick comes in handy all the time." "Clumsy?" Tidus asked. Now that he had started talking, he couldn't bring himself to stop. "You don't seem clumsy." "After what you just saw," Helix said. "Liar." Tidus laughed, and this time he didn't stop himself. "How did you do it?" he ventured. Helix squinted his eyes, considering his answer and sticking out his tongue slightly. "Well, it's kinda like," he started, gesturing vaguely with his hands. "Okay, so when you jump back, you're sliding through time, right?" Tidus nodded, his eyes fixed on Helix so as not to miss a single detail. He hadn't been sure Helix would even give him an answer. Zion would have just sneered at him, and Dasha had only shrugged and said she couldn't explain it. It was just a feeling, when he had attempted to get insight from her. Tidus hadn't braved asking any of the more experienced students at all, especially those with multiple tattoos, indicating they'd passed multiple trials. They all looked at him the way a dragon would look at a pig, like a potential meal. Okay, Helix continued. So we're always moving through time, but time is also moving through us, right? So for something like that, he gestured at the glass model, especially something so small and non-living, you can kind of just pull the time back. Rewind just that one object. Tidus blinked, then hurriedly typed what Helix had said into his notes. Time flowed through things just like they moved through time. He hadn't even thought of that before. Could he use the same principle to heal wounds? Or would that rewind his entire body? Would that even be a bad thing if it did? Slow down. I can't even understand what you're asking. Helix laughed, and Tidus realized he'd been muttering his questions as he wrote them down. He removed his hands from the comm screen, heat rising up his neck once again. Sorry, he said. This stuff, it's still... I've been learning it and using it for more than a year now, but it's still just so amazing. It is, Helix agreed. And I'm still only a beginner, technically. Only passed the first trial so far, after all. How long ago was that? Tidus ventured hesitantly. He'd been wondering this for a while, but even more so now, seeing the casual ease with which Helix had rewound time, and the fact that Helix had been the only sparring partner so far to directly counter Tidus' timecasting, instead of using a separate trick. You don't seem much older than me, but you seem like you've been practicing a while. Glad you noticed, Helix said. Yeah, well, I had my big Timecaster reveal when I was 6, so I got a head start on a lot of you. 6? Tidus asked, trying not to gape. Wait, how old were you when you did the first trial? How did you survive? Calm down. They didn't throw me into the first trial as fast as they did with you, Helix said with a laugh. I definitely would have died. They gave me more time to practice so that I stopped panicking about literally everything. I was a mess of a kitten, let me tell you. I didn't do the first trial until I was 10. 10 years old, the same age Ilaria had been when Tidus had left. It wasn't as bad as if he had been 6, but it still seemed way too young. But Helix had survived it somehow, and had been practicing timecasting since he was 6 years old. No wonder he was so much better at it. It was already like second nature to him. Wow, Tidus said. That's impressive. It's just luck. Helix waved it off dismissively. Tidus got the distinct impression he didn't consider it good luck either, and another question bubbled up in Tidus' mind. Besides, it's not as much of an advantage as you'd think. Zion's only been here 6 months longer than you, and, well, you're not exactly someone I'd dismiss based on your lack of experience. Oh? Tidus said, blinking in surprise. What do you mean? Tidus had been running himself ragged, just trying not to fall behind, to catch up to the other students so he could complete his training, to make it not a waste, to make it all worth it. I meant what I said when we sparred, Helix remarked, his expression serious. I've had more practice than you, but that doesn't make me better than you. The way you fight is smart. You need practice, but I'm pretty sure if we weren't in a controlled sparring ring, you'd find a way to level the playing field and beat me. Thanks, Tidus said, suddenly not sure what to do with his hands and shoving them into his pockets. He knew he should be careful, should distance himself. But the instructors were all so cold. Helix's words felt like being tossed a lifeline. I've never fought before I started training. I thought I would be miles behind everyone. Don't sell yourself short, Helix said. And don't listen to Zion either. They're just trying to psych you out." "I'll remember that," Tidus replied, nodding. "Hey, how did you discover your time-casting powers anyway? I've been wondering how other people, I don't know, unlock it, I guess." Something in Helix's expression closed off then, even though his smile remained and his relaxed posture didn't change. Something in his eyes shifted, and Tidus could tell he had stepped over some invisible line. He remembered in that moment that they weren't actually friends, and he still didn't know what Helix's agenda was. "Ah, that's a bit personal for a first date, don't you think?" Tidus sputtered, knocking over a stack of books with his elbow and sending them crashing to the floor. "What? No, this isn't. I didn't mean. I don't think—" Tidus stammered, trying to formulate a response, then clamped his mouth shut when Helix doubled over laughing. Tidus could no longer hold back the red that enveloped his face to the tips of his ears, and he fixed the other boy with a scowl. "Oh, man, you're just too much fun," Helix said, wiping a tear of laughter from the corner of his eye. He stood from the bench and swiped Tidus' shoulder with the back of his hand as he walked past, quickly disappearing through the library shelves. Tidus let out a huff and bent over to pick up the fallen books. Far from unraveling Helix, their conversation had only left him with more questions. Maybe he shouldn't have let his guard down and talked so familiarly with the competition. But it had made everything seem, at least for those moments, less heavy and horrible, like the tension inside of Tidus had loosened up. As good as that felt, he would have to be careful. If it was some kind of trick, he couldn't afford to fall for it. Chapter 20. Homesickness had plagued Tidus over the year and a half since he had left the Antirrhinum estate, and as the shuttle took him closer, the feeling only intensified. The bright red of the Rothzura desert sands was a wash of comfort, a familiar sight among the alien landscape his life had become. Over the horizon, he could see the sun glinting off the windows of the estate itself, dark stone towers contrasting with the desert around it. Home. His breath caught, like there was a black hole in his chest, widening with every inch he got closer to home, trying to consume everything around him and leave him completely empty. He gripped the strap of his bag tightly, the leather cutting into his palm. He needed this. He needed to come home, to recenter himself, and find his anchor again. Refocus. He needed to spend time around the people that mattered, that he could trust. The slumbering memory of his parents' rejection and Kiun's cold silence awoke in his mind. His family might not be a threat the way other Timecasters were, but they weren't exactly a sanctuary either. Except for Ilaria. Tidus focused on her instead. It had gotten harder to keep his guard up over the past few weeks. After talking to Helix once, it was like the floodgates had opened, like someone had placed a banquet in front of a starving man, except it could be tainted with deadly poison. The shuttle docked smoothly in the hangar, and the doors slid open. Tidus smiled and stepped out. His parents stood waiting for him, but before he could even open his mouth in greeting, Ilaria slammed into him at full force. "Tidus!" she squealed. Tidus laughed and wrapped his arms around her, even as he tried to make his way off the shuttle ramp. "Oh, man, you have no idea how much I've missed you, Ilaria," Tidus said. He looked up at his parents, then scanned the area around him, his heart sinking. "Is Kiun—" His mother's expression tightened, her eyes like flint, and her lips thinned. His father shifted his weight, putting an arm around his mother. "He couldn't make it," his father said. "University affairs are keeping him very busy." Tidus nodded, a pang of disappointment stabbing through him. He looked away, turning his gaze back to Ilaria. He had spent hours over the last few days coming up with things he could say to Kiun, ways to approach the conversation, to try and smooth things over with him. If he could just talk to his brother face to face, he was sure they could work things out. But Kiun seemed determined not to give him that chance.
"Did something happen?"
his mother asked, her voice as soft as a butterfly's wings.
"Between the two of you?"
A wave of guilt washed through Tidus. Kiun had evidently kept his word. He hadn't told their parents about how Tidus had died intentionally in order to save him. So what must they think about the sudden distance between the brothers? How must it seem to them that Kiun couldn't be bothered to make time to see his brother, a future Omni Tempore? "I don't know," Tidus said as honestly as he could. He knew what had happened, but he didn't know why they couldn't try to overcome it. Even now, a year later for Kiun, he still couldn't be in the same room as Tidus.
"Maybe he's jealous,"
Ilaria piped up, her voice surprisingly bitter. Well, surprising, except that Tidus knew that she knew the truth. Her words sent a trickle of ice down his spine. I'm sure that's not..." Tidus stammered, but his father held up a hand. "Let us not speculate about such things," the Baron said, his voice strained. "This is time to enjoy. You've grown so much." His father's voice cracked, and Tidus caught a sheen of tears in the older man's eyes. Tidus smiled, then stepped forward and wrapped his father in a tight hug. They had never been a particularly huggy family before, except for Ilaria. But there was no way Tidus was holding back now. He was starving for this, even as his flesh recoiled, recalling the hatred his father was capable of feeling towards him. He clung with desperation to the connection. His mother joined in, and Ilaria had never let go in the first place. For a long moment they stood there embracing, almost the entire family. Even with the frigid absence of Kiun, the closeness, the familiar scent of his family, of home, soothed Tidus like soap washing away a year and a half of pain, of nightmares, of loneliness and fear. Underneath all of that, he was still there. Still the boy who had grown up charting the Dotharan constellations or riding a carpet sled down the glass dunes in the blinding summer sun. When they finally released each other, Tidus couldn't help but laugh. "I've missed you all so much," he said.
"We've missed you as well,"
his mother said, cupping his cheek with her soft hand.
"But even more than that, we're proud of you. I can tell you've already grown so much."
She lowered her hand, then took his and raised it up to her eye level. It was his right hand, and he realized she was examining the golden tattoo wrapping around his wrist. Her eyes sparkled with pride.
"I want nothing more than to ask you about every day since you left," his mother said. "But I know Ilaria is absolutely dying to introduce you to her crystal wings. So I think I can wait a few more hours and we can talk over dinner." "Thank you, Mom,"
Ilaria exclaimed, jumping up and down so her dark curls bounced crazily. "All right," Tidus said. "I have been eager to meet those little dragons after all." He took Ilaria's hand and let her lead him away, through the winding halls of the estate to the gardens, then to the greenhouses where she had set up her crystal wing operation. She stopped bouncing as the greenhouse door whooshed shut behind them.
"Kiun needs to forgive you,"
Ilaria said somberly. Her eyes were serious as she looked up at him.
"He hasn't written to you, has he?"
"No," Tidus admitted. "But he needs time, I guess."
"He's had time,"
Ilaria said with a sharp frown.
"Now he's just being mean by holding on to it. You didn't hurt anyone. You saved him, so he has no reason to be mad about it."
She didn't lower her voice as she spoke, and caught his worried expression with a confident nod. So she had made sure the inside of her greenhouse wasn't under the same surveillance as the rest of the grounds. The crystal wings were probably to thank for that. Their breath manifested as both bright bursts of light and blasts of sound. Combined, they were enough to drive standard surveillance to go on the fritz. "It's a little more complicated than that," Tidus remarked. Maybe even more complicated than Tidus had realized, judging by Kiyun's absence. Was he really so ashamed of Tidus' failure that he wouldn't be in the same room as him? Did he believe Tidus had condemned his soul to the void? If he could just talk to Kiyun, he could explain. "We'll work it out. Once he decides to at least talk to me again, I'm sure it'll be okay. You don't need to worry about it, all right?"
"Whatever,"
Ilaria said. She let out a warbling whistle and smiled. The sounds of excited scrambling coming from farther in the greenhouse. It was filled with plants, making it hard to see more than a few feet. But Ilaria walked through without issue. Tidus followed her and was greeted by a gaggle of crystal wings bursting out of the foliage. They could stretch their heads up high enough to lick Ilaria's face now. A few of them had on muzzles, still able to open their jaws to eat, but inscribed with old draconic runes to keep their breath in check. "Looks like you have a few slow learners here." Tidus patted the head of the crystal wing nearest him. It trilled happily at his touch.
"I'm working on it,"
Ilaria said with a sigh.
"They just get too easily excited. But Arianwen there, the one by you, she's just amazing, almost ready for you."
Tidus' smile faltered at that. He stroked the dragon's head and looked down at the wide silver eyes. So trusting, so much like Ilaria in that way. I can't take one," Tidus said.
"Why not?"
"It wouldn't be fair to Arianwen. It's not a good place to have a pet." Tidus looked down at the crystal wing currently nuzzling its head against his side. Her bright silver eyes and silver horns stood out brilliantly against the opalescent scales of the rest of her body and wings. He could imagine bringing her to the cathedral. How she would be an instant target for the other students, a weakness to exploit that he would be displaying with reckless abandon. Unless he managed to hide her, but what kind of life would that be for the creature?
"I understand,"
Ilaria said.
"But if you ever change your mind, I'll have a dragon for you."
"Thanks," Tidus said.
"She's really smart,"
Ilaria continued, trying to push past the heaviness in the air.
"I barely have to teach her anything. She picks it up so fast, and she gets after her brothers and sisters if they don't listen to me."
Tidus smiled and sat down to keep petting the silver-accented dragon, and listen to Ilaria tell him about each of their personalities, and the ways she was teaching them all to control their breath, so they could become beloved pets. She sat down to lean against him while she talked. Eventually, she stopped, and he realized she was staring at him, boring into him with her pink gaze. "Oh, I should tell you," Tidus said. "They know about the resets. The Omni Tempore know."
"Oh?"
Ilaria asked, her voice hesitant. Tidus nodded, closing his eyes. "Yeah, it's all right, though," Tidus said. "I mean, it is better to die once, that's true, but that's, well, not the whole picture. I just figured you should know, officially. We're not damned to the void."
"I always knew you had done the right thing,"
Ilaria declared, reaching over and squeezing his hand. Tidus smiled and leaned back to stare at the ceiling with its kaleidoscope of rainbows.
"So, are you going to tell me what's wrong?"
she said after a moment of silence. Tidus started. "What do you mean?"
"All of your letters. You sound really sad,"
Ilaria commented, like it was obvious. And he had thought he'd done a good job of acting fine.
"And when we all hugged you, It felt like you were going to cry. I mean, I know training is hard, but what's really wrong?"
"You're a really perceptive kid, you know that?" Tidus said softly, looking away from her intense gaze.
"I know,"
Ilaria agreed.
"So spill."
Well, it is really hard, and not just because it's hard work," Tidus admitted. He had wanted to talk to her after all, and Ilaria was the only person in the universe he didn't have to keep secrets from. Or at least the only person he didn't want to keep secrets from. "I died again, once so far, but I'm sure there's more coming." Ilaria squeezed his hand, and he closed his eyes, pushing away the memory of being impaled, the face of the shape-changer melting into Ilaria's. "It's lonely," he continued eventually. "Everything is competitive, and there's no way to relax unless I'm completely alone, because everyone there is a threat." Tidus glanced back at Ilaria, hoping he wasn't burdening her too much. He needed someone to talk to, or he wanted it, but he had to be ready to pull back if his worries got too heavy for her. "There is," Tidus resumed after a moment, hesitantly. A coil of anxiety curled up in his chest at the thought of saying this out loud. But if he didn't, he would drive himself mad trying to work it out. "There is someone there who... I don't know what to think of him, really. He's been really friendly the whole time, but I'm afraid he's just lying to get me off guard or trick me or something." Tidus paused and swallowed hard. It wouldn't be the first time. Before, falling for fake friendliness only resulted in disappointment when the other person's true motivations came to light. Usually they were angling for an edge on their application to the university, a wasted attempt, but one made many times. Now the risk was much worse than mere disappointment. A false friend could spell his death permanently. Ilaria leaned her head on his shoulder and looked up at him. Tidus was struck by how mature she seemed, a far cry from the erratic little girl he had left behind. She was still energetic, enthusiastic about what she loved, but there was a focus and steel to her gaze that hadn't been there before.
"That sounds lonely,"
Ilaria said.
"And sad. I mean, I've been lonely here without you, but at least I don't have to be afraid of everyone around me. I still have my dragons. And my friends, even if they don't live here."
"Yeah," Tidus sighed, flopping onto his back and letting Arianwen lay her scaly head on his belly. "I'm glad. I don't want you to be as lonely as I have been. It's not easy. But it's part of the training, I guess. I just have to figure out how to be strong enough to deal with it."
"Maybe,"
Ilaria said.
"But what about the friendly one? What's his name, anyway?"
"Helix," Tidus answered. "He's from Olethros. I wish you could meet him, actually. You'd like him, but—"
"But you don't trust him,"
Ilaria finished. "Yeah," Tidus said. "I think if it weren't for the, intense atmosphere, we would be good friends. Like if he had come to the Antirrhinum estate as part of the Olethros study placements, we would have gotten along really well. He's way ahead of me in training right now. He's been practicing since he was 6 years old."
"Wow,"
Ilaria remarked, her face turning thoughtful. Tidus had never seen her so pensive and insightful before this. His heart twisted at how much she had grown up, how much he had forced her to grow up.
"So maybe he really isn't trying to trick you at all."
"What makes you say that?"
"Well, if he's been there since he was 6, that's like 10 years or more, if he's around your age anyway,"
Ilaria said.
"Maybe he's not trying to trick you. Maybe he is lonely too."
Tidus sighed, tracing the rainbows on the ceiling with his gaze as the dragons flapped their wings, turning it into a kaleidoscope. "I bet he is," he reflected. "I can't even imagine being in that kind of place so young."
Well then, maybe you should try letting him be your friend, Ilaria said. Maybe both of you can be less sad that way. Everything's easier if there's someone you can feel safe around.
Tidus smiled and let out a dry chuckle. It seemed so simple when she said it that way. But she didn't know about the life or death stakes. He couldn't tell her, couldn't explain how complicated it really was. But maybe she was right, and all the details were just distracting him from the truth. He felt like he was spiraling into a self-destruct sequence already. So maybe it wouldn't be any worse if he let himself be friends with Helix. It might make him more vulnerable to Helix specifically. But if he wasn't so wrapped up in his misery, maybe he would be on better guard against everyone else. Was the trade-off worth it? Even just thinking about the possibility made him nervous, and he caught himself chewing his lip. It always tasted like blood lately from biting it so often in anxiety. If he didn't figure something out, he would end up chewing it clean off. Maybe you're right, Tidus said. Maybe I can give it a try. It could be worth it, if it didn't end with Helix's knife in his back. Chapter 21. The cloud of loneliness swallowed Tidus immediately when he left the estate, after only a 2-day stay, and he was on his way back to the cathedral. Heavier and darker than before, it came accompanied by a wave of exhaustion. He could barely keep it together as he returned to his room at the cathedral. His hands trembled, and he couldn't get a full breath. Something had to change, or he wouldn't even make it to the second trial. Ilaria's words echoed through his mind as he returned to classes, every time he caught sight of Helix out of the corner of his eye. Everything is easier if there's someone you can feel safe around. That did exclude everyone. The instructors, Zion for sure, Dasha most of the time, and definitely every other student he had met. Except for Helix. If there was anyone in the entire Omni Tempore or training program that he could even imagine feeling safe around, it was Helix. Tidus sat in his seat in the lecture hall, physically refraining from tapping his foot while the instructor spoke. He was paying attention as much as he could and taking notes, but he couldn't keep his gaze from being continually drawn to the back of Helix's head several rows ahead of him. Making the decision to give friendship with Helix a shot was one thing. Now he had to initiate it. After weeks of avoiding Helix and shutting down almost every conversation the other tried to initiate, what if he had used up Helix's patience and lost his chance? What if it was too late and Helix hated him now? "This month you will be working together to advance your understanding of timecasting," the instructor said, giving all of them a cold stare. Like most of the instructors, he was part of the Interim Legion. He had passed all 5 trials and would be an instructor at the cathedral until he gained a rank. "You will be assigned teams, and at the end of the month we will see if you have learned anything." Tidus straightened, scanning the room. There were 8 of them in this group, those who had passed the first trial and awaited the second. There had been 9 of them until 2 weeks ago. Lynn, Morid, Jazz, and Celia. The instructor listed names, and Tidus' heart squeezed. "You will be one team. Tidus, Zion, Dasha, and Helix the other." He was on a team with Helix, which was good, but also Zion, which sounded about as pleasant as rubbing pepper flakes in his eye. Zion shot him a scathing look from across the room, and Tidus avoided their gaze. Worse, Helix didn't look back at him at all. He just hunched his shoulders and made himself smaller in his seat. Tidus swallowed a lump of nerves and tried to listen to the rest of the instructions. "You are all able to sense the flow of time and manipulate it to some degree," the instructor said. "Now you will be honing your connection to time itself. learning to do more than sense the flow, but to sense the ripples and effects of those moving through it. Time sense is a powerful tool. It allows you to reach beyond what your natural senses can tell you, to bypass your own physical limitations. It is also key to being able to work effectively with other Timecasters. I know you all see each other as competition, but remember, you will have to work with each other at times, so you'd better know how to do it. Tidus chewed his lip and opened his notes as the instructor displayed a holographic diagram to explain the theory behind time sense. Theory was helpful in knowing how to use it once a person had access, but Tidus had quickly learned that theory didn't usually help him figure out how to access a specific ability. Unlocking abilities was intensely personal. He wondered if that was why the Omni Tempore training had such a sink-or-swim feel. There was only so much that could be taught. You either figured it out, or you didn't. When the instructor finished, Tidus grabbed his comm screen and slid out of his seat, then paused. Helix was still sitting in his chair, head resting on one palm, as he rotated his timeline diagram around his comm screen. Tidus swallowed his nerves and waited until everyone else had left, then walked up next to Helix. He wished he had a plan for what to say, a strategy of some kind, but he didn't. All he had was desperation and a shot in the dark. "Hey, you all right?" Tidus asked. Helix started, then looked up at him with narrowly slitted pupils. Tidus shifted his weight and cleared his throat. Yeah, he had put this off way longer than he should have if he'd wanted to make a good first impression, or second, or third. He might have burned this bridge entirely. "Just, you seem kinda down," Tidus said. Coming out of his mouth, the words sounded even more ridiculous than when he'd only imagined this conversation. Tidus cringed. "Never mind." "So, you're not avoiding me anymore?" Helix asked, direct and to the point. His tail was coiled tightly around the leg of his chair. "Decided it wasn't worth the effort," Tidus said with a slight smile, trying to channel Helix's usual sense of humor. "I mean, your company isn't worse than being alone after all." Helix's face broke into a grin at that, sending a rush of relief through Tidus. "Oh, wow, what a compliment. Being around me isn't worse than being alone. I'll have that inscribed on my grave," Helix retorted, wiping an imaginary tear from the corner of his eye. "You really know how to make friends." Helix scooped up his comm screen and bounded out of his chair, slinging his arm around Tidus' shoulder as they both turned towards the door. The sudden change gave Tidus whiplash, and he found himself off balance, just trying to keep up. He swallowed a stammer. "You were the one who kept following me around like some kind of stalker," he said, elbowing Helix in the ribs. "How's that for a weird way to make friends?" "You know, in my defense, I've been living in this kill-or-be-killed academy since a very formative age," Helix pointed out. "The expectations for my social skills should be very low if we're being realistic." Tidus laughed, the act staving off the agitated nerves crawling under his skin. It felt good, talking, laughing, leaving the lecture hall with Helix instead of just among the crowd. "So, how was your visit with the family?" Helix asked. "Oh," Tidus said, hesitating. It sounded so normal, so casual, but even though Tidus was trying to open the door to friendship, after so many months of guarding himself, it felt like such an intimate, personal question. He swallowed. It was just a friendly question. It was really good to see them. Maybe it felt extra personal because of the fact that his brother hadn't shown up and refused to talk to him, or the fact that his little sister knew secrets about him that only the Omni Tempore knew, or that everything at home was complicated and fragile because Tidus had killed himself twice there. The part of him that was terrified of making friends with an enemy whispered sinisterly, what if Helix was looking for weaknesses? What if he was going to use Tidus' answers against him? "Hey, look, you don't have to talk about it if you don't want," Helix said, seeming to catch on to at least some of what Tidus was thinking. He turned his gaze away, fluffy cat ears flattening against his head. It sent a stab of guilt through Tidus' gut. "I get it. Sorry, I shouldn't have asked. It's not something everyone is ready to talk about. Sedna, I'm such an idiot." "Whoa, you pray with that tongue," Tidus said, trying to break the tension. Helix blinked at him. "What?" "If my mother heard you cursing like that, all your meals for a week would taste like soap," Tidus replied. Helix's ears raised off his head, and Tidus let his shoulders relax. "Well, lucky for me, your mother isn't here to tell me off," Helix said. "No kidding," Tidus agreed. "And it wasn't. I can talk about my family. I just wasn't expecting the question." He didn't say out loud that it took effort not to assume the worst about Helix's intentions. That was definitely not the way to go about making friends, even this kind of tentative, dangerous friendship. Helix nodded and scratched the back of his neck awkwardly. "Well, I should have known better than to ask about that kind of thing," he commented with a sigh. "I don't have anyone left to visit, so, I would get it. You know, if there was something back there you didn't want to talk about." "Oh," Tidus said. He wanted to ask about what had happened, but didn't. It made sense with how young Helix had been, that perhaps he had lost his family at that age. That young, even discovering time-casting abilities wouldn't have let him change anything. His sister's words rang in his ears. Maybe he's lonely too. "It was actually my sister who convinced me to stop avoiding you," Tidus admitted to cut off the awkward silence bubbling up between them. "Oh? I'll have to thank her," Helix said with a grin. "You know, we're supposed to be studying as a team of 4, not as couples." Dasha appeared between them, pushing Helix and Tidus apart, so she could wrap an arm over both of their shoulders. "We're not studying yet," Helix said at the same time that Tidus exclaimed, "We're not a couple." Dasha laughed, releasing them both and shoving them forwards. "Tidus, I was just kidding," she said. "Unless you two would make a pretty cute couple, you know." Tidus' face heated up, and he scowled at her. Of course, Dasha would sabotage his already fragile attempt to make friends with Helix. "She's just jealous because we'd make a way better couple than her and Zion do," Helix retorted, swishing his tail. "Wait, what?" Tidus frowned. "You and Zion?" Dasha shrugged, examining the sharp nails of her left hand with mock casualty. "Don't get confused. They're just hot," she said. "It's not about their personality." "But seriously," disbelief washed over Tidus. "Why?" "Oh, Tidus," Dasha taunted with a wicked grin. "You just wouldn't get it." Tidus opened his mouth to ask what exactly that was supposed to mean, then thought better of it. "Whatever," Helix laughed. "But seriously, I'd like to eat without Zion criticizing my chewing technique, so don't even think about making us group up until after lunch." "No worries there," Dasha said, shaking her head. "They always eat alone. And let me tell you, I deeply regret asking why." "Do us all a favor and keep it to yourself," Helix begged. "But we should start working soon on this whole time sense thing," Tidus said, his mind turning back to the deadline. 1 month. And then they would be working against the other team. "Can you find Zion right after lunch and meet us somewhere?" "As you command it, lordling." Dasha pushed away from them to give an exaggerated bow. Tidus rolled his eyes. Dasha and the other students were apparently not going to lose interest in mocking his family status anytime soon.
I already have an idea, and it involves blindfolds.
She winked at them and then ran off. Tidus shot Helix a nervous glance. "How worried do you think we should be about the blindfolds?" he asked.
"Hard to say,"
Helix said, squinting after Dasha.
"I mean, I would say she was suspiciously excited, but she's always like that."
"Yeah, her enthusiasm is like pathological," Tidus agreed. Helix snorted and shook his head. They entered the dining hall and split up to get food. Tidus tried hard not to stare at Helix as he walked away, his cattail curled around his ankle again. He had seen Helix do that a lot, like when he wrapped his tail around the chair leg, almost like a nervous tick, despite the fact that Helix never looked nervous. He thought of Helix, younger and alone, all of his family dead. Had it happened when Helix had discovered his abilities like Tidus? And if so, had he managed to save himself and no one else? The thought of that was like a weight on Tidus' shoulders, trying to crush him into the ground. He couldn't imagine moving on, continuing to live, in a world where he had to watch his family die twice, and they stayed dead. How did Helix manage to be so relaxed, so easygoing all the time? Ilaria had been the only thing keeping Tidus going on the worst days, with her letters and encouragement, her secret-keeping. She was the only one who had given him the push to even consider a friendship with Helix. Without Ilaria, Tidus thought the loneliness might have actually killed him. Helix didn't have anyone like that. What kept him going? As Tidus sat down with his food, he considered he had a much more pressing issue to think about. Was he really going to let Dasha blindfold him?